Good morning to you. It's Tuesday morning. It's bunging down outside, but it's good to be here, and thank you for joining us for our Bible talk for today. For your prayers, we have a wonderful cohort for confirmation this time. We've got about 10 people from our church waiting to get confirmed here in Penn, and a whole lot more people from other churches around the deanery as well. As they begin their journey of faith, do please pray for these good people. So please pray for our candidates on their new adventure in faith, which is fantastic. Lovely group of people, but like we all, they need our prayers. But you've come this morning because you're on our adventure through the letter to the Hebrews. Let me remind you, we are in chapter 6. I'm going to start reading now at verse 9 to the end of the chapter. So here goes. Hebrews chapter 6, starting to read at verse 9. Even though we speak in this way, beloved, we are confident of better things in your case, things that belong to salvation. For God is not unjust. He will not overlook your work and the love that you showed for his sake in serving the saints, as you still do. We want each one of you to show the same diligence, as so to realize the full assurance of hope to the very end. So you may not become sluggish, but imitators of those who, through faith and patience, inherit the promises. When God made a promise to Abraham, because he had no one greater by whom to swear, he swore by himself, saying, I will surely bless you and multiply you. And thus Abraham, having endured, obtained the promise. Human beings, of course, swear by someone greater than themselves, and an oath given as confirmation puts an end to all dispute. In the same way, when God desired to show even more clearly to the heirs of the promise the unchangeable character of his purpose, he guaranteed it by an oath, so that through two unchangeable things, in which it's impossible that God would prove false, we who have taken refuge might be strongly encouraged to seize the hope that's set before us. We have this hope, a sure and steadfast anchor of the soul, a hope that enters the inner shrine behind the curtain, where Jesus, a forerunner on our behalf, has entered, having become a high priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. And this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I will tell you about Melchizedek probably tomorrow, I think. You have to wait for that one. But we are in chapter 6 today. The first bit is kind of a bit of a pickup from yesterday. One of the things with Bible readings to remember, it's always in context. There's always a before and an after as well. And the first few verses, verses 9 to 12, really kind of pick up us on yesterday. And the writer is reminding us, like I say, the message through the stick of the rock of the book of Hebrews is not to give up. That though being a Christian may be hard at the moment, and though you may be tempted to lapse into paganism, do whatever it's going to be, don't hang on in there. And in yesterday's reading, he reminded them one of the reasons for hanging on in there is because if you fall away, it can be very, very difficult, if not impossible, to come back. And so yesterday he gives them a kind of warning of that. But then you kind of get a bit of backtracking. I think he suddenly realised, oh my goodness, what I just said. Then he goes on to say, well, of course, I know none of you are like that. Of course, don't worry. I know that, having warned them that, it's very, very difficult if you fall away. But I know none of you are like. I'm sure you'll be absolutely fine, and I'm sure God will take notice of the things you've done and the works you've made. And he kind of backtracks a bit, really. So having warned them yesterday of the woes that happen from falling away, he then kind of goes on to kind of give them a bit of flannel and pick them back up again, But I'm sure, even though we speak, I'm confident of better things in your case. That's verse 9. So, having warned them yesterday, with the warning ringing in their ears, which I guess is kind of important to have, he then kind of, so he doesn't want them to be discouraged. He kind of bolsters them up again and says, whilst I've said that warning, none of you will be like that. I'm sure you'll be absolutely fine. So, hear the warning, but take the encouragement as well. Then he goes on to talk about the promises of God. Now, this is quite tricky, but I'll try and explain it. God, in the book of Abraham, promises Abraham twice that he'll be blessed and he'll have a huge family, okay? God promises him at least twice that he'll be blessed. Well, God promises Abraham in chapter 12 and in chapter 22. In chapter 12, God tells Abraham he's going to be the father of many nations. And despite the fact that he's 100 and his wife Sarai is 99, despite all that, he promises that he'll have a child and she'll have a child and father of many nations. And It's no wonder that they called their child Isaac, which means laughter. You can imagine, how would you feel if you were 99 and told you were going to give birth to a child? You might find it mildly amusing. I'm sure Sarai and Abraham did as well. But nonetheless, it says, Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. So, and God blessed him. So in chapter 12, because Abraham kind of intellectually went along with God and said, okay, you said it, I'll believe it, I'll trust you, I'm going to go with it. Okay, so because of that, Abraham gets blessed in chapter 12. Later on, of course, Sarah has the aforementioned child, Isaac, and everything's going tickety-boo. In chapter 22 is one of the stories which, I have to say, of all the stories in the Bible, is probably the one that reads most difficult to us today. It's a horrible story, really. The top and bottom of it being, and there's actually a picture of it in St. Bart's Church, Abraham with a knife in his hand. It comes to it that Abraham, when challenged, is prepared to sacrifice his son. Okay, now it's a horrible story, and it reads very, very badly to us today, and it's not an easy read. But if you can kind of, if it's possible to overlook the difficult bits of it, what the writer wants you to see is here is somebody who is prepared to trust God all the way. Okay, like I said, it's a very, very difficult reading for us, and there's no way of saying it to make it sound any nicer, really. The point is, however, that Abraham was prepared to trust God all the way. He didn't just trust God in chapter 12 by believing intellectually this is going to happen, but when it came to it, he was prepared to trust God with what was dearest to him. He was prepared to trust God all the way. And because of that, again, in chapter 22, like I say, just hear the trusting of Abraham, if you like. Then because of that, God blessed Abraham again. So God blesses Abraham because he believes God with his mind in chapter 12. He also blesses Abraham because he trusts God with his life and what's important to him in chapter 22 as well. He doesn't just talk the talk, he actually walks the walk with God as well. And I think what that is saying really to us is, obviously not in the same way at all, of course, but in the same way, we as Christians don't just believe God with our head, but we trust God with our hearts and lives as well. That's really important. But why can we do that? We can do it because of the nature of God, because God is steadfast and true. It's interesting, he says, that when people swear by something, they swear by something bigger than themselves. They swear by something. Whereas in God's case, of course, he can't swear by anyone bigger than himself because he is the biggest that there is. So he swears by himself, so to speak, if that makes sense. Because it shows that God is almighty and there's no one greater than him. Also, he also tells you here that God does not lie and that God is true to himself. God never tells a lie. What God says, God will do. And because of that, he's got what he calls an anchor for your soul. Anyone been in the boys' brigade? We have an anchor for the soul, steadfast and while the billows roll. It talks about a steadfast hope. And because God is so great, and because God is so holy, and because God is so faithful, we can trust God with anything. So yet another reason for not giving up on the faith is because God has blessed us, but also because God is trustworthy and true. That when God says God will do something, God does it. That we have a true anchor for our souls. Someone who'll hold us steady when life gets rocky, like an anchor does. Will hold us steady and keep us safe. And that's what God is to us. So, in our reading this morning, you have firstly you've had the warning yesterday about not turning it back and what the consequences of that, but he kind of reminds, but of course I know he kind of reassures them. I'm sure that you'll be fine like that. And I think the same is true for us today. We to hear the warnings, actually, the importance of sticking in there. But of course, we're all wonderful people, aren't we? And I'm sure that God knows what he's doing. I know God knows what he's doing. I'm sure that we will all go through with it. I'm sure we'll all be true to our faith as well. Secondly, God blessed Abraham twice. Firstly, because he believes God in his head. But secondly, the second time in chapter 22 in Genesis, because he trusts God with his heart. And the message here is don't just trust God with our heads, but let's walk the walk with God as well, even when it gets difficult. And third thing to say is that the reason we can be sure, the reason we can have hope, and the reason we can trust, and the reason we can go on with God is because God is faithful, because God is true, because God knows what he's doing. The old hymn sang, which we had at our wedding 26 years ago, great is thy faithfulness, O God my Father. More tomorrow. Tomorrow we will find out.